Elliot Ramsey didn't hear the girl approach, but her words sliced into his mind like a crack across glass. "Sir, that number's wrong. It doesn't balance." He froze. The pencil halted mid-air. Beneath the pale streetlight, the unfinished equations in his leather-bound notebook glowed faintly, a half-drawn formula on algebraic symmetry. A theorem he had rewritten no fewer than 32 times. And now, a ragged-haired child with a basket of chocolate bars had just named the flaw that a panel of the nation's top professors had once dismissed with a patronizing frown. Elliot slowly lifted his head, as if afraid that if he looked too quickly, the girl might vanish like a shadow in his failing memory. But she stood there, pale blue eyes, frayed canvas shoes, a torn scarf lopsided around her neck. "What did you just say?" he asked, voice rough from disbelief and fatigue. She didn't flinch. "I said that number isn't symmetric. There are 3 levels on the left, only 2 on the right. It leans." Elliot glanced down at the notebook. She was right. The diagram he had just drawn by hand was off-center. Not in value, but in structure. But how could a candy-selling child see that? "Where do you go to school?" he asked gently. "At home," she replied, curt and honest. "My dad says learn with your eyes, not just books. I sell candy to help pay for his repair jobs." He stared at her. Once considered one of the sharpest mathematical minds in the country, Elliot didn't believe in vague intuition. But something in her voice, not innocence but pure instinct, quieted every logical impulse. She saw something real. "What's your name?" he asked. "Emily," she said, then lifted the basket. "Want a candy bar, sir?" He shook his head but smiled. For the first time in months, Elliot Ramsey smiled. Not because he had found a solution, but because someone had seen what he couldn't admit. That evening, Elliot returned to his 6th-floor apartment with his notebook still open on the desk. The room was as cold and silent as ever, the old heater clicking like tired clockwork. Piled across his desk were dozens of failed versions of the Ramsey-Hudson theorem, all crossed out in red, blue, and eventually pencil, as if his confidence had faded alongside the ink. He sat down and turned back to today's page. The place Emily had pointed out. Yes, it was unbalanced. Not numerically, but geometrically. A subtle flaw that only someone who felt rhythm in mathematics would notice. A flaw he had once been accused of, but never dared face. 15 years ago, the Ramsey-Hudson theorem had been hailed as a master frame for intrinsic symmetry in multi-axial structures. But 5 years later, during a peer review at MIT, Professor David Welling had stood and quietly pointed out a void. Not a miscalculation, but a misfeeling. The model didn't match the world. It leaned. And Elliot had stood there, silent. No defense. No rebuttal. Just silence. Like a clock whose mainspring had finally snapped. The next day he returned to the bench near the bus stop, where he usually wrote, morning and evening, as a kind of ritual for a man the world had chosen to forget. He wasn't sure if Emily would come back. But she did. On time, with her candy basket swaying, and a look as calm as if last night had not just shaken the very foundations of his belief. "Come here," he gestured, patting the empty seat. Emily sat beside him without hesitation. "Can you show me how you see symmetry?" Elliot opened his notebook and handed her a pencil. She didn't say a word. She took the pencil and began to draw. No ruler, no measurement. Just slow, deliberate strokes, like composing music. And what Elliot saw stunned him. The shape she drew matched precisely the model he had once only imagined, but could never define. A wave-like diagram, rhythmic, coiled yet balanced. A form of felt symmetry with no precedent in textbooks. He swallowed hard. "What do you think about math?" he asked. Emily shrugged. "I don't think. It's like music. When something's off, I feel it." That answer left Elliot speechless. Because once, he had felt that way, long ago, before cold logic and academic politics dulled his sense of beauty. "Your dad's a repairman?" he asked. She nodded. "He's good at measuring with his ears. He knocks once and knows how long the pipe is. He calls it back-sense reasoning." Elliot chuckled. Back-sense reasoning. It sounded like a forgotten axiom from ancient mathematics. "What do you think about my theorem?" He pointed to the page. Emily was quiet. Then she said, "I think you're forcing it, but the shape doesn't want to be that. It's bending away." That night, Elliot couldn't sleep. He erased the page, rewrote it by hand. No computers, no latex, just pencil and paper. And for the first time in years, math spoke to him again. Not in definitions, but in whispered images. He called it the first emotional theorem. No one knew it yet. No one had seen it. But in Elliot Ramsey's soul, a new theorem had begun. And its first co-author was a candy-selling girl named Emily Carter. It was a proof Elliot Ramsey had locked away for 6 years, unfinished, broken, and quietly unbearable. And now, a girl with chalk-stained fingers was solving it with a smile. The room smelled faintly of dust and old wood. It was Elliot's study, cramped, quiet, and untouched by anyone else's hands for years. The curtain stayed drawn most of the time, filtering daylight into a kind of mathematical twilight. Emily sat on the floor, legs crossed, scribbling on a sheet of graph paper he had given her. She had refused the chair. "The floor helps me feel the shape," she had said. Elliot didn't understand what that meant. He didn't need to. What he did need to understand was happening right in front of him. Laid out on the table behind him were the pieces of a broken proof, a segment from his original Ramsey-Hudson theorem. Line 42 to line 56, to be precise. A section that had once held an elegant recursion of rotational symmetry, until the contradiction appeared. He had tried everything to fix it. Substitution, inversion, fractal recursion. Nothing held. It always fell apart at the convergence step. Hudson had called it a dead loop. Elliot had called it the end of his career. Now, Emily was playing with it. He had copied the original structure by hand and asked, gently, cautiously, if she could feel anything wrong in it. She had stared at it for a while, then asked for a blank page, then another. And now, here she was, drawing shapes that didn't resemble the proof at all. "Can you explain what you're doing?" Elliot asked, trying to sound curious and not skeptical. Emily didn't look up. "Not really, I'm just letting it fall into place." "Fall into place?" "Yeah, the shapes. They keep leaning, like dominoes. But if I mirror this one..." She turned the paper sideways. "And push here instead of here. Then, this one catches it." She smiled faintly, then added, "It's like folding laundry. If you fold it wrong, the pile gets crooked." Elliot blinked. Folding laundry. Dominoes. This wasn't mathematics. It was movement. Balance. Spatial intuition. And yet, something in her language made sense in a way his equations had not for years. He stepped closer. "Can I see?" Emily handed him the graph paper. He stared at it for a long time. At first, he thought it was a child's doodle, lines and curves and overlapping arcs. But as he let his eyes settle, something deeper emerged. Nested rotational loops, inverse spirals, a correction not by addition but by flow, a reordering that removed the collapse point entirely. He turned back to his proof, pulled out the pages from line 42, held them side by side, and the gap, the logical chasm that had defeated two Fields medalists, was gone. He didn't speak, couldn't. His breath caught somewhere beneath his ribs. She had just solved it. He looked at her. Emily was nibbling the edge of a candy bar, legs still crossed, face unbothered. "Do you know what you just did?" he asked. "No," she said. "Was it good?" He laughed, not mockingly, but with something between wonder and grief. "Yes," he whispered. "Yes, it was very good." That night, Elliot didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He barely moved from the desk. He redrafted the section. He wrote it cleanly, carefully. No substitutions, no heavy notation. He followed Emily's structure, not the lines, but the balance of them. He even made margin notes in her language. Rotation mimics resistance. Reverse left when spiral feels forced. Fold along visual anchor. Where the shape wants to rest, let it. For a man who had built his career on rigor, it was the most irrational, unprovable method he had ever used. And it worked. By morning, line 42 to line 56 were intact. No contradiction, no collapse, just a smooth, breathing continuation of the theorem. Elliot leaned back in his chair, the gray light of dawn casting his desk in a silvery haze. He whispered aloud, "She fixed what I couldn't." That afternoon, he walked to the corner cafe with a printed draft tucked in his coat. He hadn't emailed Margaret Ellison in almost 7 years. She was the last colleague who hadn't publicly distanced herself after the collapse of his theorem. Margaret had once told him over coffee, "Your mind sees structure like others see color." He had never forgotten that. He found her name in his inbox, scrolled up to their last thread, dated June 9th, 7 years ago. With a deep breath, he composed a new message. To Margaret Ellison. Subject, a revision, and something unexpected. Dear Margaret, I hope this finds you well. I have revised a portion of the Ramsay Hudson work, specifically the segment we once debated at Princeton. This new approach emerged not from calculation, but from observation, purely visual, yet startlingly precise. Attached is draft 0.1 of the updated model. You'll notice that the recursion issue from line 42 onward has been addressed, not resolved by algebra, but through a new ordering. Also, please note the co-author on this draft. I know it will raise questions. I am prepared for them. With deep respect, Elliot Attachment, Ramsay Carter Model 0.1.pdf. He hovered over the send button for several seconds, then clicked. It was done. That evening, he met Emily again at the park bench, where they usually talked. The late autumn air had turned colder, and she wore 2 scarves, one wrapped like a lopsided ribbon. She offered him a candy bar, and this time he took it without hesitation. "I sent it," he said. Emily looked up. "Sent what?" "The thing you fixed. To a friend. A professor." She blinked. "Will I get in trouble?" "No," Elliot said softly. "You'll get something far rarer. Recognition." She didn't speak for a while. Then, in a voice that trembled just slightly, she asked, "Will they believe me?" "They may not," Elliot admitted. "But it doesn't matter." because I do." She looked away, blinking quickly.
"That's the first time someone said that and meant it."
"I know," he said. "That's why I sent it." They sat together in the quiet, two figures in the fading day, one trying to redeem a past, the other unknowingly changing the future. And in his coat pocket, Elliot carried the first bound copy of Something Beautiful. It bore her name. When Professor Margaret Ellison opened the file labeled Ramsey Carter Model 0.1, she expected an apology, a footnote, or perhaps another doomed revision. What she did not expect, what no one expected, was elegance. Her office at Princeton was dim with late-afternoon light when the email arrived. Margaret had been grading graduate papers, pausing only to refill her tea or rub at the weariness behind her eyes. The name Elliot Ramsey blinking in her inbox stopped her mid-sip. She stared at the subject line for a long moment before clicking. The last time she had spoken to Elliot, he had been a shadow of the man she once knew. A haunted figure walking the halls of their shared conference in Boston, notebooks clutched like lifelines, voice unsure. That had been 6.5 years ago. Now, he had sent her a draft, and he had included a name. Emily Carter. Margaret squinted at it. A former student? A new collaborator? She opened the file, and within 5 minutes, she stopped reading and stood up. 30 minutes later, the chalkboard in her office was filled corner to corner. Margaret had rewritten the core segment of Elliot's new structure, line 42 to line 56, and for the first time since his original collapse, it held. The recursion was no longer forced. The transition from level 3 to 4 was natural, almost graceful. The visual symmetry, the one missing from the original theorem, was now present not as an artificial fix, but as a consequence of the new order. She sat back, heart racing. Something had shifted. Elliot hadn't just patched the problem. He had seen something new. Or rather, someone else had. She reread his message. This new approach emerged not from calculation but from observation, purely visual, yet startlingly precise. And the name again. Emily Carter. Margaret leaned forward and began typing. To Elliot Ramsey. Subject, a revision, and something unexpected. Dear Elliot, where did you find her? I ran the segment through our recursive simulation. No contradiction, no collapse. I even passed it to Arjun. He couldn't break it either. This isn't a revision. This is something else entirely. Come to Princeton, both of you. I want to meet her. M. 3 days later, Elliot and Emily stood outside the east gate of Princeton University. The wind tugged at Emily's scarf. She looked up at the grand stone archways, eyes wide but unreadable. I thought it would be taller, she said. Elliot chuckled softly. It's taller inside, you'll see. They walked together through the quad. Students passed by with backpacks, earbuds, the occasional curious glance at the older man and the young girl carrying a plastic candy basket. Elliot carried the folder. They entered Fine Hall and took the elevator up to the 5th floor. Margaret's office door was already ajar. She stood when they entered. Elliot, she said, her voice a mix of surprise and something warmer. Then she looked at the girl beside him. And this must be Emily. Emily gave a small wave. Hi. Margaret gestured to the chairs. Please sit. The room fell into a kind of careful stillness. I didn't believe it at first, Margaret said, eyes on Elliot. I thought perhaps you'd found someone with a fresh angle, a postdoc maybe. But this, she tapped the folder. is not the work of a trained mathematician. No, Elliot agreed. It's the work of someone who sees without needing to name what she sees. Margaret turned to Emily. Do you know what you've done? Emily shrugged. Not really. She fixed what two Fields medalists couldn't, Elliot said quietly. Margaret studied the girl again. Not just her face, but the stillness in her body, the absence of anxiety. She wasn't trying to impress. She wasn't afraid to be dismissed. She simply existed, outside the game. You weren't taught this, Margaret said. So how do you know it? Emily looked at the window. I just do. It's like when I walk across the street and can tell if the ground's uneven, even if it looks flat. Margaret exhaled slowly. Spatial intuition. Embedded symmetry. You feel structured, don't you? Emily nodded. I don't know the words, but I know when something's off. Margaret leaned back, letting silence settle. Then she said, Would you let me show your model to the department? Elliot froze. He hadn't expected that. Not yet. Maybe a private discussion. Maybe cautious curiosity. But show the department? He looked at Emily. She was quiet, but not shaken. Okay, she said, but only if I get to watch. Margaret smiled. Deal. 2 days later, in a closed seminar room at Princeton's mathematics department, Emily Carter sat quietly beside Elliot Ramsey while 4 professors and 2 PhD candidates reviewed the revised theorem on a projector screen. Margaret led the session. We are not here to debate Elliot's history, she began, but to evaluate what's in front of us. The room nodded. One of the younger professors raised a hand. Who is Emily Carter? Margaret didn't answer. She clicked to the next slide, a full visual mapping of the revised segment, annotated by hand. This, she said, is what she saw. The room went still. For the next 20 minutes, the group picked through the structure. They tried to find faults, tried to replicate the contradiction, and failed. At the end of it, one of the older professors, Dr. Levins, leaned back and crossed his arms. It's unconventional, but it works. Another added, There's elegance here. Odd elegance. Almost musical. Margaret nodded. Then she turned to Emily. Would you like to say anything? Emily stood, small in stature but somehow grounding the entire room. I don't know how to write proofs, she said. I don't know what half of this is called, but I do know when something doesn't want to stay standing, so I help it lean the other way. No one laughed. No one scoffed. Instead, Dr. Levins whispered, My God, she's an intuitive geometer. And in that moment, the flawed legacy of a once disgraced theorem transformed, not because it had been repaired, but because it had found its missing voice. A voice in a girl no one saw coming, a girl who sold candy. She shouldn't be in the room, said the man with 2 PhDs and a dozen published papers, and for a brief second, Emily believed him. The seminar had ended, but not the tension. Outside the glass-paneled room, the hallway buzzed with restrained debate. Some professors huddled around printed copies of the Ramsey-Carter model, marking pages with silent awe. Others stared at Emily from across the hall, whispering behind lattes and lanyards. Elliot felt it in his chest, the unmistakable weight of academic suspicion. Emily sat next to him on the bench outside the room, legs swinging slightly, her scarf tucked under her chin. She looked up at him and asked in a whisper, Did I say something wrong? No, Elliot said firmly. You said something honest. Then why did the tall man look so angry? Elliot didn't answer. That tall man, Professor Raymond Coyle, had been present at the seminar. A towering figure in the field of topology, known for his razor-sharp critiques and icy precision. He had listened without interrupting, without expression. And then, as the room cleared, he had walked slowly to the board and said just 5 words. She shouldn't be in the room. Margaret had stiffened. "Excuse me?" "She's not a scholar. She's a child. You're dressing intuition in the robes of rigor. That is dangerous." Emily had not heard those words, but Elliot had, and he knew what they meant. Not just, she shouldn't be in the room, but she doesn't belong in the equation. Later that day, Margaret called Elliot into her office alone. "She's causing a storm," Margaret said, not unkindly. "She is the storm," Elliot replied. Margaret smiled, then rubbed her temples. "Raymond's filed a formal concern with the review board." "Of course he has. He claims this is unethical, passing off untrained observation as mathematics. He's calling it intellectual theater." Elliot almost laughed. "And what did you say?" "I said genius is sometimes illiterate, and that equations don't care who sees them first." Margaret paused. "But Elliot, I need to ask, is she ready for this?" He looked out the window, down to the courtyard where Emily sat alone on a bench, sketching spirals in the condensation of the metal armrest with her fingertip. "She's already in it," he said. "The real question is whether we are." That evening, back at Elliot's apartment, Emily was quiet. She didn't eat much of her dinner, a peanut butter sandwich she had made herself. She left the crust. "Did I ruin something?" she asked. "No," Elliot said gently. "Some people just don't like being surprised." "But I didn't try to surprise them." "I know." He sat beside her on the carpet. The room was dim, lit by a small desk lamp and the yellow wash of city light through the window. Emily pulled out a folded sheet of paper from her pocket. "I was working on this. It's not for math, just something I wanted to understand." She unfolded the page. It was a diagram, a rough sketch of the lecture room, but everyone was drawn with weights above their heads. "This is how it felt," she said. "Some people had heavy thoughts, like bricks. Others had thoughts that floated too fast and bumped into each other." Elliot stared at it, a kind of emotional map. The idea was absurd, and yet, looking at it, he understood exactly what she meant. "Where's yours?" he asked. Emily pointed to a tiny figure in the corner. Her weight was different, balanced, but glowing. "I didn't feel like I was leaking," she whispered. "Even when he said I shouldn't be there." Elliot swallowed. "You belong in every room you step into," he said, "especially the ones that try to push you out." The next morning, they returned to Princeton for a closed Q&A session, a format Margaret had arranged to allow Emily to speak directly to the team of reviewers. It was rare for a mathematical proposal to warrant such a forum. But this wasn't ordinary math. Emily walked in wearing her oversized sweater and a mismatched skirt, candy basket slung over one shoulder. She looked 10, perhaps younger. But her face, her eyes, they carried something older than any proof. Elliot sat beside her. Margaret stood by the board. 7 professors took their seats. Professor Coyle, of course, was in the center. Margaret began the session formally, but it wasn't long before Coyle raised his hand. "This is not personal," he said, "but academic integrity matters. I'd like to ask the girl a question." Margaret glanced at Emily. She nodded. Coyle stood. "In your own words," he said, "explain to us what symmetry is." Emily looked at him for a moment. then said, "It's when something rests, like when your two hands feel the same when you fold them, or when the space between things feels fair." Coyle raised an eyebrow. "That's poetic, but it's not an answer." "It is to me," she said. He pressed on. "Can you define convergence?" Emily thought, then pointed to the floor. "When drops of water roll to the same crack, even if they start on different sides of the stone." Some professors chuckled, not mockingly, softly, like they had just remembered something. Coyle's lips tightened. "Can you write the standard form of the Jacobian matrix?" Emily blinked. "No." "Then how do you expect us to trust that you understand what you've changed?" Elliot leaned forward, ready to speak, but Margaret raised her hand and looked at Emily. Emily said, "I don't expect you to trust me, but you do trust your own eyes, and you saw it didn't break." The room went still. "Maybe I don't know the names," she added, "but I know the tilt, the tension. I can feel when something's about to fall, and I can feel when it's about to stand." She paused, then said, quietly but clearly, "You don't have to call it math, but I do." After the session, no one spoke to Coyle. He left quickly. The rest remained. Margaret approached Emily and crouched to her level. "You did something braver than most scholars ever do," she said. "You told the truth in your own language." Emily looked up. "Did I mess up?" "No," Margaret smiled. "You translated." That evening, as the sun sank into the cold horizon, Elliot sat with Emily on a bench overlooking the university lawn. "Do you regret coming here?" he asked. She shook her head. "I only regret not knowing more words." "You'll learn them," he said, "but don't ever let them replace what you already have." "What's that?" "The part of you that feels truth before it has a name." Emily leaned her head on his arm, and in that moment, as dusk painted the sky in soft gold and gray, the question that had haunted both their lives, "Do I belong?" was finally answered. Yes. Yes, you do. 3 days after submitting the Ramsey Carter paper, Margaret opened the journal's database and found it gone. No record, no draft, no review, as if it had never existed at all. The email had been sent on a Tuesday evening just after sunset. Margaret had sat alone in her office, rereading the abstract 3 times before finally attaching the paper and clicking Submit to the Journal of Theoretical Mathematics, the most prestigious and most conservative publication in the field. The subject line was simple: a correction to Ramsey-Hudson symmetry, visual recursion in nonlinear space. Co-authors, Elliot Ramsey, Emily Carter, age 11. She had stared at that second name for a long time before pressing send. The journal promised a 2-week preliminary screening before peer review, but Margaret received a response after only 3 days. Except it wasn't a response. It was silence. And when she logged into the editorial system to check the status, the submission wasn't there. Not rejected, not pending. Vanished. Elliot received her call at 9:42 p.m. "It's gone," she said. "Wiped." He paused. "Rejected?" "No, not even a record. As if I never submitted it." Elliot sat in silence, fingers pressed to his lips. Margaret exhaled on the other end. "I even checked the email logs. No confirmation, no ticket, but I know I submitted it." "You have the original file, right?" "Of course I do," she said. "But that's not the point." He already knew what she meant. This wasn't a formatting error or system bug. This was deliberate. The next day, Margaret walked into the editorial office of the Journal. She didn't call ahead. She didn't wait for an appointment. She asked for Dr. Harold Brenner, senior editor. He met her in the hallway, polite but cool. They hadn't spoken in nearly a year, not since Margaret had defended a controversial paper by a young Iranian mathematician who proved a result using geometric intuition instead of standard notation. She still remembered Harold's words. "If we open the door to this, we lose the structure that built us." Today, his expression was unreadable. "Margaret," he said, "what brings you here?" "I submitted a paper on Tuesday," she said. "I believe it was removed." He didn't blink. "What was the title?" She gave it to him. A pause, then, "I'm afraid we have no record of such a submission." She stared at him. "I watched the upload complete," she said. "I received a success message. The file was attached." "Well, then perhaps you misread it," Harold said gently. "Our system can be finicky." Margaret stepped forward. "Was it deleted internally?" "I wouldn't know," he said. "But if a submission does not meet minimum criteria, it did." He didn't respond. "Did you read it?" His jaw tightened. "Margaret, even if I had, I would not be permitted to say so." She nodded slowly. "I understand," she said. Then she turned and walked out. But as she did, she noticed something, just for a second. A young assistant editor watching from the corner, looking down quickly as their eyes met. That night, in Elliot's apartment, Emily sat at the table peeling the wrappers from peppermint candies and stacking them into a little tower. "So they don't like it?" she asked. "It's not that they don't like it," Elliot said, choosing his words carefully. "It's that they don't know what to do with it." Emily thought about that for a moment. Is that the same as pretending it doesn't exist? He hesitated. "Yes," he said softly. "Sometimes." She frowned. "That's like when Mr. Williams at the bus stop ignores me when I say the price changed. Like he thinks my voice isn't real." Elliot's heart sank. She wasn't wrong. 2 days later, a package arrived at Margaret's home. No return address. Inside was a flash drive and a note in careful, blocky handwriting. "This was pulled from our server before deletion. You didn't imagine it. Be careful who you CC." She plugged it in, scanned it for malware, and opened the folder. There it was. Ramsey Carter Model 0.1.PDF, time-stamped. Logged, confirmed. Someone inside the Journal had saved it, before it was erased. Margaret forwarded the file to Elliot. This time, she did not include the Journal. Then she forwarded it to someone else. Dr. Lynn Alvarez, editor of Open Symmetry Quarterly, an independent journal known for publishing unconventional but mathematically rigorous work. Lynn replied within 6 hours. "I read it 3 times. It's stunning. It's strange. It breathes. I want it." "And yes," Lynn added, "I'll keep her name on it, front and center." The new submission went through smoothly. Within 4 days, Lynn published a preview excerpt online under the title, "The Girl Who Sees Structure." And in the corner of that page, in clean serif font, by Emily Carter, age 11, and Elliot Ramsey. The page had fewer than 300 views by midnight. By morning, it had over 40,000. And by the end of the day, someone posted it to a forum called The Math Underground, with the caption, "She's not a prodigy. She's a mirror." It went viral. Not instantly, but with the quiet intensity of something real. Mathematicians around the world began downloading the draft. Some praised it. Others criticized it. Many simply stared at it for hours, unsure why it made them feel so much. It wasn't just correct. It was alive. And still, Emily remained unaware of what she had started. She sat in Elliot's living room, playing with ribbons and a broken compass, rearranging the arms to form new kinds of stars. "Do you think they'll erase it again?" she asked. "No," Elliot said. "Not this time." "Why not?" "Because now too many people are watching." Emily nodded, then tilted her head. "That's good," she said. "It means I don't have to remember it all by myself." And Elliot, who had once been forgotten by the world, understood in that moment the true danger of the paper. It gave memory to something the world wanted to forget. Not a theorem, not a structure, but a girl. Before they questioned the theorem, they questioned the girl. Her name, her age, her presence. As if the math could be real, but she could not. The backlash began with a blog post, not from a formal journal, but from a tenured professor at a prestigious university. The title was simple: Authorship, Ethics, and the Myth of the Child Genius. It never mentioned Emily by name, but it didn't have to. The language was sharp, clinical. It praised the structure of the Ramsey Carter paper while casting doubt on its origins. It used phrases like romanticized authorship, the allure of innocence in scientific narrative, and co-authorship as performative virtue. Elliot read it 3 times in silence. Then he closed his laptop, turned to Emily, who was building a pyramid from toothpicks and marshmallows, and asked, "Do you want to stop?" She looked up. "Stop what?" "Sharing your ideas. Being seen." She blinked. "No." "Even if people say you don't belong?" She smiled faintly. "That's what they always say. Before they copy you." The post spread quickly among academic circles. Within days, it was referenced in other publications, forums, newsletters, even private faculty emails. The core accusation was simple, though never directly stated. Emily Carter doesn't exist. Or if she does, she didn't write this. Because an 11-year-old girl with no formal training could not have understood non-linear symmetry. Because a candy seller with second-hand shoes and a mismatched scarf could not have restructured a failed theorem. Because the institution would rather believe in mathematical resurrection than human disruption. Margaret called Elliot a week later. "They're trying to reassign credit," she said. "Not officially, but in whispers." "To who?" "To you. Or to no one." Elliot paced the room. "They'd rather think I invented her. She's too inconvenient to be real." There was a silence. Then Elliot said, "What if we show them the footage?" Margaret hesitated. "You mean the seminar?" "No. Before that." Elliot still had the camera. It wasn't a professional setup. Just an old handheld recorder he had used for chalkboard explanations when he taught online. He had turned it on, out of habit, the day Emily first began sketching the recursive loop that would become the new theorem. The footage showed her on the floor of his study, drawing arcs with a broken piece of chalk. Her fingers were smudged, her voice soft. She wasn't explaining, not really, just murmuring to herself, "It wants to tilt here. If it goes too far, it snaps. But if I let it rest right there." Elliot never thought that footage would matter. But now, it was proof. Proof that she was the source. Proof that she was real. Margaret uploaded a short clip, just 90 seconds, to a new page titled, "This is Emily Carter." No analysis, no defense, just her. The video showed her adjusting a loop of her diagram, then looking up and saying, "There, it breathes now." It went viral in less than 24 hours. And this time it wasn't just mathematicians who shared it. It was artists, engineers, teachers, parents, people who saw not just a theorem, but a child who saw the world differently and made it whole. But not everyone celebrated. Emails began arriving in Elliot's inbox. Some were polite, others cruel. Many asked the same thing. Why are you using her? What's the game here? Are you exploiting this child for redemption? Is she even real? Elliot read them all. Then he wrote one response and posted it publicly. Yes, she is real. Yes, she is brilliant. No, I did not save her. She saved me. Elliot Ramsey. One morning, a letter arrived by mail. No return address. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. Inside was a single sentence. She doesn't fit the mold, so they will try to melt her. Elliot folded the note and placed it in the desk drawer beside the original copy of the Ramsey-Carter draft. He turned to Emily, who sat cross-legged on the floor, sketching stars inside spirals. "How are you doing?" he asked. She shrugged. "People are loud right now." "Yeah. But I'm still drawing." He smiled. "That's what matters." She looked up at him. "Do you think they'll stop me?" "No," he said, "because they're already behind you." That week, a reporter from The Atlantic contacted Margaret. She asked for an interview. Not about the paper, but about the girl. Margaret said, "Only if she agrees." Emily thought about it, then asked, "Will they ask questions I don't know how to answer?" "Probably." "Can I answer them with drawings?" "Yes." Emily agreed. The article was titled, "The Girl Who Never Took a Test, but Solved One of Math's Hardest Questions." It went deeper than the theorem. It traced her childhood, her mother's illness, her nights selling candy at the bus station, her chance meeting with a forgotten man and a broken chalkboard. It didn't try to explain her genius. It just listened. And in doing so, it did something academia had failed to do for decades. It made room. Of course, there were more critics, more doubts, more attempts to dismiss or diminish. But by then, the story was no longer a secret. It was a seed, and seeds don't argue. They grow. One night, Elliot found Emily asleep on the couch, a sketch pad open on her chest, spiral patterns trailing off into stars. He gently lifted the pad and saw something written on the last page. Not a diagram, just a sentence. In large, childlike handwriting, "I don't know why I see it, but I'm glad I did." He stared at those words for a long time. Then he closed the notebook and let her dream. They gave her 10 minutes and a dusty chalkboard. She gave them something they didn't know they'd lost. A question none of them could answer. The Vermont Symposium was quiet. It wasn't the kind of place where breakthroughs happened. Not the kind of place where breakthroughs were even expected. It was the kind of weekend event where aging professors shared old jokes, young postdocs tested conference nerves, and everyone drank too much coffee in rooms too small for their ideas. But that Saturday morning, a name appeared on the printed schedule that made a few eyebrows raise. Emily Carter. Notes on Geometric Rest. Co-author, Elliot Ramsey. The room wasn't full, but it wasn't empty either. And when an 11-year-old girl with a scarf too long for her neck and a candy basket by her side walked to the front of the room, 23 people shifted forward, some curious, others amused, none expecting what came next. Emily didn't begin with a greeting. She simply walked to the board and began to draw. Her hand moved carefully, steadily. First, a simple loop, then a spiral, then loops inside the spiral, like something folding, then folding again, but not collapsing. The board slowly filled with a form none of them had seen before. Not a shape, but a rhythm. She paused. "It's not just a pattern," she said. "It's the way something rests when it's trying to keep balance without breaking." Silence. No one laughed. Then she added thin, almost invisible lines connecting curves to corners, bending over themselves. "And here," she continued softly, "is where it breathes." In the back row, a professor lowered his coffee. A student paused mid-type. Someone began filming. Elliot, watching from the side, didn't move. He had never seen this one. Even in her notebooks, this was new. He realized she hadn't copied this from memory. She was inventing it right then, with no plan but the pressure in her hands and the tension in the air. Emily stepped back, then looked at the room. "It's not finished," she said, "but I think it's already trying to say something." After a long pause, someone finally asked, "What is it of?" Emily tilted her head. "I don't know," she said, "but I think it's trying to tell me where things go when they're too complicated to stay straight." Another voice, older. "Is it mathematical?" She nodded. "But not the kind with numbers. More like the part that comes before the numbers." A professor in the front whispered to himself, "Pre-formal structure," and then asked aloud, "Can you show us more?" Emily hesitated, then took up a piece of chalk and with a single smooth motion added a second spiral beside the first, but this time mirrored and touching at a single point. "This one is for what we don't see," she said. And for a moment, no one breathed. After her 10 minutes, the applause was hesitant, but not because they didn't appreciate it, because they didn't know how. One by one, professors and students approached Elliot. Some shook his hand. Others just nodded at Emily, who was now sitting cross-legged on the floor, eating a granola bar like nothing had happened. An hour later, in a side room used for breakout sessions, 5 senior mathematicians met with Elliot and Emily privately. "I hope you don't mind," one said. We've never seen anything quite like that." Emily looked up. "Okay," she said. "I can show you more, but I don't know what it's called." "That's fine," said another. "Let's just talk." What followed wasn't a lecture. It wasn't a proof. It was a kind of unfolding. Emily drew. They asked. She answered. Sometimes with words, sometimes with drawings, sometimes with questions of her own. But near the end of the session, a tall woman with silver-rimmed glasses, Professor Helen Ortiz, posed a challenge. "This is all beautiful," she said, pointing to the structure on the board. "But how do we know it's meaningful? It's elegant, yes, but elegance can be deceiving. What function does this serve?" Emily stared at the diagram. Then, after a pause, she asked quietly, "Have you ever solved something that stopped being true as soon as you stepped away from it?" Helen blinked. "You mean, like a model that only works under tight conditions?" Emily nodded. "That's what I'm trying to stop." She stepped forward and pointed to one of the spirals. "This part holds even when you forget what it's called. It's true even if no one finishes the sentence. It's the kind of shape that doesn't need to be told it's right. It just stays." And then she turned to them all and asked, "What if we're not supposed to be solving everything? What if we're supposed to be listening to it first?" Silence. Elliot felt something shift, because he knew what had just happened. She hadn't given them a proof. She had given them a question they didn't know how to answer. And in that room, filled with decades of knowledge, stacks of publications, and names etched into journals, no one spoke for a very long time. Afterward, when the session had ended and most had trickled out, one young assistant professor lingered. He walked over to Emily, knelt beside her, and said, "That was not what I expected." She looked up, smiling slightly. "It wasn't what I expected either." He hesitated, then added, "You asked something in there I've never heard in a math room before." "What?" "You asked us to listen." Emily shrugged. "Well, shapes talk too." He laughed gently. "I think they're just not used to being heard by an 11-year-old. Emily looked away. "Maybe the problem isn't that I'm 11, she said. "Maybe it's that I remember what silence sounds like." That night, back in their hotel room, Elliot asked, "How did you come up with that second spiral?" Emily looked up from her notebook. "I didn't," she said. "It came up by itself." And she paused, as if trying to explain something he couldn't yet see. "Some drawings are waiting," she whispered. "You just have to show up before they give up." In another state, far away, a professor who had attended the session sent a screenshot of the spiral diagram to a friend working at a national research lab. There was no caption, just the image. And 2 minutes later, a message pinged back. "Where did this come from?" "You're not going to believe it. I need the source." The echo had begun. But Emily, that night, simply fell asleep on the window seat, curled around her sketchbook like it was a pillow. Because what had begun as a question was about to become a map. They called her the candy girl with a chalkboard. What they didn't expect was how deeply she'd divide the world, without saying a word. The camera didn't know what to do with her. It lingered on her scarf too long, then on her eyes, unsure whether to read them as childlike or ancient. The crew had only expected a feel-good story. A washed-up professor, a gifted girl, one miracle moment, 5 minutes of smiles and closure. But when the CBS anchor watched the raw footage from the Vermont symposium, she didn't smile. She whispered, "Play that again." And she did. 5 more times. What Emily had drawn, it wasn't just interesting. It wasn't even comprehensible to most viewers. But there was something in the way she moved, the way she stared at the diagram after she finished, not proud, not uncertain, just listening, as if waiting for it to say something back. The segment aired 2 weeks later, on a Sunday morning when most of the country was stirring eggs and flipping through silence. No one expected mathematics to enter the living room, but it did. Through flickering images, slow zooms, and a soft piano track, the story unfolded. Elliot's voice narrated much of it, steady and reserved. Margaret appeared, too, speaking of a shape that waited decades to be seen. Then Emily. She didn't speak much, just a few sentences, spliced from her interview. "I didn't want it to break." It looked tired, like it needed to rest. "I only draw what won't stop knocking." She smiled once, barely, and for 10 quiet minutes, the country watched. The response was instant. The first wave came from teachers, artists, single mothers, retired engineers, people who'd always suspected that genius didn't follow the rules, that maybe wonder had no credential. They flooded the station's inbox with messages. "I cried, and I don't even like math. That child reminded me of my son. She made me feel like silence is a language." But the second wave was colder. It came from universities, statements from credentialed scholars, long posts on academic forums. The mathematics is undeclared, unverifiable. This is not how we test understanding. An 11-year-old cannot co-author such a paper without guidance. This borders on fraud. Some were more brutal. This smells like another attempt at viral sympathy dressed as brilliance. Others masked it as concern. We must protect children from being used as symbols. Let's not elevate her until we're sure she even understands what she's doing. Emily said nothing. She didn't need to. Her drawing had already spoken. In the middle of all this, Elliot felt a strange sense of déjà vu. The headlines, the doubt, the insistence on proof before wonder. He'd lived it once. But this time, it wasn't his name they were questioning. It was hers. And she was still a child. He tried to shield her. Turn off the TV, cancel the follow-ups, decline interviews. But Emily seemed untouched. Not indifferent, just removed. As if the noise was happening in another country entirely. She sat on the floor most evenings, arranging bits of thread or leaves into slow spirals, then quietly undoing them. Once, Elliot asked, "Do you want to say something back?" She looked up. "To who?" "To them." Emily shrugged. "They're not the ones I drew it for." Still, Elliot couldn't stay silent. He wrote a letter, published it online. A calm, precise, deeply personal essay titled "On What Cannot Be Measured." He spoke of Emily's drawings, of her quiet, of how her lines resolved tensions no equation could. He didn't try to defend her intellect. He defended her presence. "We don't ask trees to submit abstracts before blooming. Why are we so terrified when something grows outside the lab?" The piece went viral. Margaret reposted it. So did several young mathematicians across Europe. One professor anonymously added, "I've spent 20 years studying systems that collapse when observed. This girl seems to have drawn the collapse before we looked." But the noise didn't stop. The journal that had initially accepted Elliot's revised theorem, with Emily's name as co-author, now delayed its response. A board member leaked an internal email thread. "Are we truly comfortable printing a child's name beside a former pariah?" And in one case, even if the math holds, the optics don't. It was no longer just doubt. It was erasure in slow motion. And Emily still said nothing. Until one evening, after a quiet dinner of grilled cheese and tomato soup, she looked up from her sketchbook and asked, "Why do people want me to be wrong so badly?" Elliot froze. He didn't know how to answer, so he just sat beside her and whispered, "They're scared." She blinked. "Of what?" "That maybe truth isn't always theirs to find." That night the mail came late. No envelope. Just a folded page slipped under their apartment door. It was written in careful, slanted cursive. No name, no header. Just words. "I've taught for 40 years. I've published papers that were praised, then forgotten. I've seen every kind of genius, loud, fast, angry, precise, but never quiet like hers. I believe her. And I have a question that I've never been able to answer. Ask her this, if you can. What happens to a spiral when it runs out of space? I'll be waiting for her answer." A friend in the faculty shadows. Elliot read it twice, then handed it to Emily. She read it once, then smiled. "That's a good question." And for the first time in weeks, she picked up her pencil again. Her name disappeared with a click. Not a word, not a reason. Just gone. As if she'd never existed on the page at all. The email arrived on a Monday morning. Elliot opened it absent-mindedly, still in slippers, still holding a half-eaten banana. He didn't expect much, just another update, Another delay. The publication board had been slow, cautious, nervous. He'd learned to expect silence dressed as professionalism, but this email wasn't silent. It was efficient. Final. Dear Mr. Ramsey, we're pleased to inform you that your revised paper on fractal harmonies within asymmetric field systems has been accepted for publication in the March issue. We appreciate your contributions to the field and look forward to future work. The editorial committee. No mention of Emily. No co-author. No acknowledgement. Elliot froze. He scrolled back up, then down again, then opened the attached draft, and stared. Her name, gone from the title page, gone from the footnotes, gone from the dedication. Even the line, inspired by the work of a young collaborator, had been removed, as if she had never existed. He called Margaret first. She didn't answer. He sent her a screenshot. 10 seconds later, she called back. No, she said. No greeting, no preamble, just no. I checked twice, Elliot whispered. 3 times. They didn't even notify you. They sent it like it was normal. Margaret was quiet for a long time. Then she said, with a voice so calm it trembled, "They're testing if we'll stay quiet." Emily was sitting in the corner of the room, coloring a leaf. When Elliot told her, she didn't cry. She didn't even look surprised. "They erased me?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Does it mean I didn't help?" "No. It means they're afraid you did." Emily tilted her head. "Why?" "Because you don't belong to them," Elliot said. "Because they didn't make you." She looked down at her hands, at her fingernails still faintly stained with graphite. "Do I still get to draw?" "Always." Margaret came over that afternoon. She brought hot tea, a stack of legal printouts, and a look in her eyes Elliot hadn't seen since their early days of protest. "Do we sue?" he asked. "No," she said. "We go public. They'll say we're bitter, making noise. Then let them hear it." The next morning, Margaret posted a short letter to her university blog. To whom it may discomfort, the co-author of the recently accepted paper is named Emily Carter. She is 11 years old. She is also one of the clearest mathematical thinkers I have encountered in my lifetime. She does not hold a degree. She does not belong to any institution. She sells candy on sidewalks, and the paper is hers as much as it is Elliot Ramsey's. If you print it without her name, you are not publishing. You are stealing. It went viral in less than a day. People remembered Emily. The video from Vermont resurfaced. Clips from the CBS feature were reposted. Hashtags trended. Her name was Emily, co-author, not ghost. Math belongs. To all, and then, unexpectedly, letters began to appear. From high school teachers, from graduate students, from children. Hundreds of them. Drawings, notes, graphs, spirals, some crude, some brilliant. All saying in different ways, "I saw myself in her." Elliot printed dozens and taped them across the apartment wall. When Emily came home from a walk and saw them, she didn't speak for a full minute. Then she pointed to one. It was a crayon sketch from a boy named Theo. He was 8. In it, Emily stood beside a mountain of equations, holding a candle. She whispered, "That one feels warm." The journal tried to stay silent, but the silence broke. An anonymous leak exposed the editorial email thread. The girl is a liability. We cannot risk publishing a non-credentialed minor. Remove her quietly. If Ramsey complains, we can delay indefinitely. Margaret posted it. No comment, no embellishment. Just truth. Within hours, 3 editorial board members resigned. The journal issued a revised statement. Due to a miscommunication, the name of co-author Emily Carter was omitted in error. We apologize sincerely and will issue an updated draft immediately. But it was too late. The apology fell flat. Because it wasn't just about credit anymore. It was about who gets to belong. That night, Emily sat by the window, drawing again. Not spirals this time, not weaves, just a small, fragile dot in the center of the page. Then rings, soft, incomplete, radiating outward. She titled it, Echo. Elliot watched her from the doorway. They tried to erase you, he said. She looked up. And? And now the world's drawing you back in. She smiled, but her eyes held something quieter than triumph, something deeper. I don't want to win, she said. I just don't want to disappear. You won't, he said. Not anymore. The next day, a package arrived. No name, no return address. Inside, a thin, black notebook. First page. I believe you. I have more questions. I hope you'll keep answering. Your friend in the faculty shadows. Emily traced the writing with one finger, then whispered, Okay, and turned to the next page, ready to begin again. The auditorium held its breath, not for an answer, but for a question a child had never been allowed to ask. The symposium wasn't supposed to be large, just a gathering of thinkers. A weekend in New Haven, 35 names on the list, some professors, some independent researchers, a few prodigies who'd written books before turning 20, and Emily Carter, age 11. No degree, no title, just a notebook full of quiet and a name that half the world now knew. The invitation arrived in a flat envelope with silver lettering. Emily read it without blinking. Then she whispered, Are we going? Elliot said, Only if you want to. She looked out the window. The sun was drawing soft spirals in the fog. I think I do. The hall was older than most people inside it. Marble columns, velvet chairs, gold sconces that flickered like candlelight. Emily stood near the edge of the stage, fingers brushing the page of her sketchbook. She wasn't scheduled to speak, but everyone knew she would. They just didn't know when. The morning was filled with dense presentations, equations that danced and collided, theories that tangled themselves in jargon and admiration. Some whispered, She's just a child. She shouldn't be here. Others whispered, She's the only reason we are. Elliot sat near the back, next to Margaret, his hands folded in his lap, a silence inside him deeper than nerves. Because this time, it wasn't about him. After lunch, the moderator, a kind man with trembling hands, stood and cleared his throat. We have one more guest, he said. Silence fell. No introduction, no bio. Just a small figure walking slowly toward the center of the stage. Emily carried nothing but a single piece of chalk. She didn't look at the audience. She looked at the board and began to draw. No words, no theorems, just motion. A quiet curve spiraling outward. Then another. Not symmetrical, not perfect, but alive. Somewhere near the middle, she paused, turned around, looked directly at the 100 faces staring back, and said, What if everything wants to rest, not resolve? What if the shapes are tired of being solved? Would we still call it math if it made us feel something we couldn't prove? No one spoke. She smiled. Okay, she said softly, and stepped down. They didn't clap. not out of disrespect, but because something in the room had gone still, like the pause between lightning and thunder. Elliot stood, not quickly, not for show. He walked to the front where Emily waited. Then he turned to face them all. Dozens of scholars, some who had doubted, some who had defended, some who had simply watched, afraid to believe. "She drew that," he said, his voice clear. "Not because she wanted you to applaud, but because it wouldn't leave her alone." A few heads nodded, others bowed. "She's not a mistake," he continued. "She's not a miracle. She's just someone you didn't expect." He placed a hand gently on Emily's shoulder. "And she's my daughter." The word didn't echo. It settled. Soft, final, real. The moderator stepped forward, blinking back tears. "Would you," he asked, "be willing to publish her drawing in the closing pages of the proceedings?" Elliot looked at Emily. She tilted her head. "Only if we leave room around it," she said. "Room for what?" "For it to breathe." That night, back at the small apartment, the lights were low. The walls were still covered in letters, drawings, notes from children around the world. Emily sat on the floor with a blank page. Elliot brewed tea. "Do you feel finished?" he asked. She thought a long while. "No," she said, "just beginning." He sat beside her. After a moment, he said quietly, "Do you want me to file it? The paperwork?" Emily didn't answer right away. She reached out, took his hand, then leaned her head gently on his shoulder. "You already did," she whispered. Months later, when the published volume of the symposium arrived, the final page had no numbers, no diagrams, just a child's drawing, unlabeled, unboxed. And beneath it, a line that read, "This space is for whatever you still don't understand, but refuse to stop loving." And somewhere, in a quiet room, a girl with a pencil smiled, because she had never wanted to be right, only real. Some stories don't ask for applause. They just want to be told, in silence, in a glance, in a curve no one has named yet. Emily Carter is fictional, but children like her, the ones with questions no one listens to, with quiet drawings outside the walls of academia, are real. This story is a reminder. Intelligence does not belong to a lab coat or a framed degree. It might live in a candy girl with a pencil, sketching a world not to be praised, but because it simply won't stop knocking. Thank you for walking with this story all the way to the end. There are no superpowers here, no magic, just patience, wonder, and lines that made no sense to anyone until they did. If you've ever felt overlooked, ever asked a question no one answered, ever felt like you didn't belong in the room, then this story was written for you. Thank you for staying. And if you can, keep drawing something of your own with those quiet hands of yours.